Welcome to Narkis Bible Study. We are looking at Luke 19, verses 45 to 48. And I am going to be sharing a little PowerPoint to help us follow the text. This is the cleansing of the temple. We're looking at the Luke account here of the temple cleansing. But of course, we know this is actually a story written about in all Gospels, but there are differences. So the synoptic Gospels tend to line up as they do according to their name. They see things from the same perspective and sometimes even have the same order. So we'll be looking at both the synoptics perspective and John's perspective. So you'll remember this starts out, then Jesus entered, or literally, and Jesus entered the temple courts and began to drive out those who were selling things there. Okay. So here's a picture of the temple. I know most of you know all this stuff, but it's good to envision what we're talking about here. This is taken from the miniature model of Jerusalem in basically Jesus' time, Second Temple times. This is Herod's temple, the little mini model. And you can see that there's a big base. The big rectangle is the base of the whole temple area. But the temple itself is that little rectangle in the middle, or the little gate. So I have the temple off to the right corner, the temple itself, and then the whole temple area. And then just to the north, which for us is to the right, you see Antonia Fortress, which by some datings was built started to be built 19 BC, which may tie into the Lucan account. Anyway, you have this grand big court area, and then at some point there would have been a barricade between the actual temple, because in this big court area, you're outside of the temple proper. So it isn't actually holy in the same way that the temple is holy. But so it's often called the Gentile court of the Gentiles, or the Gentiles court, because they had a plaque that if you were a Gentile or unclean or whatever, you could come up to a certain point, and then after that you couldn't enter. And our text, it's an interesting question to ask, because our texts don't actually say where Jesus was in the temple, where the sellers would have been. But by all practical ideas, everyone in their footnotes say the court of the Gentiles, because you can see this big old space. You see the colonnades. You could have set up a nice little table there with selling all kinds of animals. I'll show you from the backside. Okay, so we're looking as if we're looking from Kidron Valley here. Now we're going to change directions on the other side. So that big pillar on top, in the top corner, that would have been the entrance to the temple from the west, and like from the hill of Jerusalem, the upper city. And in this particular reconstruction, they didn't know what they know today, which is that this entrance, probably there was like a bridge that extended all the way to the upper city. So you could walk from the upper city straight into the temple without having to go down into the little valley, the Cheesemaker Valley it's called, underneath. That big arch you see underneath, there was also a marketplace. And in fact, if you have visited the Robinson Center here in the Temple Mount, they used to have a video, they've now discontinued, but it was of a pilgrim coming to this temple that is known throughout the world because there's not a single statue in it. And it's this great world wonder. And this pilgrim goes to the cheesemaker's alleyway, and he buys a goat for his sacrifice. And he goes to one of the mikvaot to purify himself before his sacrifice. So that all happens down. We know that there was a marketplace underneath. So it's interesting as I think through this story to think, where where is this story happening exactly? And what is the issue here? Because obviously, when you come to the temple, you need to buy the animals to sacrifice. And the closer to the temple, the better, because if you're going to buy a big animal, let's say a cow, how are you going to get it in the temple? You know, it's much easier if somebody's already got it there and you buy it. So these are just some practical questions to think of, as I know a lot of people reading the text don't tend to think about those questions, but I think they do at least color the way we understand things, and we ask new questions that way. Anyway, so in this picture, for the record, it would have carried on straight. There would have been coming straight out of the temple. That first little arch down would have then just continued straight across up on a high level, right to where it would meet the hill.
Sharon, can I ask you, I mean, would they have schlepped cows all the way up the steps, or if those steps really did exist then?
Well, that's the interesting question. How would they have gotten cows in the temple? I'm sure they had a way, and maybe from the other side, it's easier, as I showed you, like this is from the opposite side. There may have been an easier gate to enter if there was. Some people hypothesize another ramp over the Kidron Valley.
Right.
And then, of course, I don't know, the Antonia Fortress is more of a Roman thing, so they wouldn't have been coming in from there. Yeah, so it's a good question how they would have gotten cows into that area. I mean, goats and lambs are no big deal, but cows are a little bit harder.
And I understand that the mikveh was at the southern wall.
Yes. So where you see here the Solomon's colonnade, that roof, brown roof area, there's a bunch of pillars under that. They call it Solomon's colonnade. And then below that, off on the left side of the picture, were the southern entrance steps. And there are many, many mikvaot all in that area that people would use as they're trying to purify themselves to come to the temple.
And I suppose that's where in second chapter of Acts, well, the baptism took place of
people,
the 3,000.
Possibly, depending how many and all of that. Yeah, and so when you've purified yourself for the temple, of course, you don't want to touch anything or anyone impure until you actually go into the temple. Depending who you are, would determine how far in you could go. So if you're a Gentile, you would stop at a certain point. And then women, however, in Jesus' day, I'm a little bit, I don't know all the research of what the issue would have been in Jesus' day, but for sure women would have naturally not been pure a lot of the time. So they would have been on the outskirts. I know in Jesus' day in synagogues, there probably was not yet a division between men and women, that there was several hundred years later. So that's an interesting thing when you talk about some of these dynamics. There is change within the system. So we're going to talk about the temple again a little bit later. And this is your picture you can think of. This, of course, is Herod's temple. Previous temples had a much smaller base, and Herod kind of expanded it and made it very, a world wonder. Everybody was impressed. Okay, so he walks into where the people are selling their goods, maybe in Solomon's colonnade or somewhere in that area. And he says to them, "It's written, my house will be a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of robbers." And this is a great little quote. First of all, we'll point out that he is tying together, or you could say he's splicing two verses together. He's quoting two sections of verses from the Bible, and it's not just free speech he came up with. And this particular verse, the first one, maybe I'll get it, here it is. in Isaiah 56:7 is special to us at Narkis because it is the verse we have out on our lawn that says, "My house will be a house of prayer to all nations." And we are an international congregation in Jerusalem, and that was the motto verse for setting it up way back in the 20s. Was it 1928? Gary can correct me. And of course, we're not the temple, but a congregation of believers. Christians, Jewish believers, Arab Christians, were all part of the first congregation. So here we have it in its original context, Isaiah 56:7. I will bring them to my holy mountain. I will make them happy in the temple where people pray to me. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. For my temple will be known as a temple where all nations may pray. And that's the net translation. And I gave you the other translation that was used in our text in the New Testament. My house will be a house of prayer. It's interesting that the Net Bible doesn't use the same wording in both places. But my house will be a house of prayer for all nations. That's just a more literal rendition. My house. And of course, we know God's house is the temple. And this in Isaiah is following a section dealing with foreigners. Sorry. And, what's going on? This is not good here. Dealing with foreigners and their inclusion, where God is saying, no, even foreigners, if they come to believe in me, they can also be joined in and they can also come. It mentions, if you go back and read the chapter in Isaiah 56, that they need to follow him, obey him, and keep his Sabbaths. That's what it talks about. But that other nations, not just Israel, would be able to come to the temple. And that's interesting when you think about court of the Gentiles in Herod's temple, because it's implying that a Gentile could not go all the way into the temple. They have to stay in the outer courts. I don't know if Isaiah would have agreed with him. Okay, so the first half is coming from that context in Isaiah. And then the second half is coming from Jeremiah 7:11. And here we have a different context. So I've included a little bit more so we see the original context. But just look at you. You are putting your confidence in a false belief that will not deliver you. You steal, you murder, you commit adultery, you lie when you swear an oath, you sacrifice to the god Baal, you pay allegiance to other gods whom you have not previously known. Then you come and stand in my presence in this temple I have claimed as my own and say, we're safe. You think you are so safe that you go on doing all those hateful sins. Do you think this temple I've claimed as my own is to be a hideout for robbers? You had better take note. I have seen for myself what you have done, says the Lord. So that phrase, a hideout for robbers, that is our den of robbers. And if you read the Hebrew here, it's a rhetorical question. So, ha-me'arat paritzim haya habayit hazeh? Is it a cave of people breaking in? And so the idea here is that if you have been doing all these sins, you've been going against God's commandments in all these areas. Don't think that you can get off scot-free if you just run to the temple. It's not a hideout for robbers. Like, who you are is who you are. Like, don't think that just being there is somehow going to change what you did. And so it's an interesting concept. Don't make it a safe house. Treat it like God's holy house, but don't take advantage of it and think you can basically cover over everything you've done by just going there. And of course, this ties into this whole concept of what is the temple. And we know from the Bible, it was holy ground. It was set up by God. And he said he would put his name there and his presence would be there. But he also was very strict about not thinking that the temple was like magical. What do I mean by that? Well, when the Assyrians attacked Jerusalem in 701 BC, Hezekiah was king, and they prayed and everything, and the Assyrians left. And we have external evidence from the Bible that shows this. Sanherib, he came, he tried to get Jerusalem, and he couldn't, and he left. And so we have a verse that says, I did it for my sake and for the sake of my servant David. And so people could easily understand that to mean, what's my sake? Well, the temple's in Jerusalem. He saved Jerusalem because his house is there. So as long as the temple's in Jerusalem, we're safe, you know? And then the interesting thing is sometime later, the Babylonians come along. And in Jeremiah's day, everybody is saying, Heichal Adonai, which means God's temple, God's temple. And Jeremiah says, don't say Heichal Adonai. Let me see, I think I have it here somewhere. He says, don't trust in these lying words saying, the Lord's temple, the Lord's temple, the Lord's temple. I will have to find you that reference later. But because in Jeremiah's day, God had given a word that they were going to exile. And he said, you're not going to be saved. And this is it. But people still couldn't conceive that God would let his temple be destroyed. And so, but it really does come against this concept of magic through the temple. And I think we see that in this Jeremiah chapter 7. Don't treat it like a talisman, like some lucky thing. If I just go in there, then everything's great. You know, that's not what it's about. And obviously, what God cares about mostly is what you're doing most of the time. And Jeremiah specifically brings up stealing, murdering, committing adultery, lying when you swear on oath, and sacrificing to the god Baal, which is, they're all contradictions of the 10 Commandments, not contradiction. They are all breaking the 10 Commandments. And so, and they're moral laws. And that is really what is important, you know, in the grand scheme of things. So, hold on, let me move my. Now, I'm going to pull this in now. We're going to deal with John in a little bit, but it's interesting that in John's version, he talks about a house of marketers, or what do you call it? Emporium in English comes from this word, emporiu, sellers. And he says, don't make my Father's house a marketplace. And it's the same concept, but maybe a little different. It depends how you take Jesus' interpretation of Jeremiah 7:11 there. When he says, don't make the temple a den of robbers, what has caused it to become a den of robbers? That's a question for us to think about. Because in Jeremiah, what had caused it was that the people's actions in their everyday life. And then they're just running to the temple trying to think that that would somehow absolve them magically. And he's saying, not at all. What you've done stands. And so here, you know, a marketplace and a den of robbers are a little bit different. Of course, we have the context that we're going to get to regarding marketplace. What is so bad about selling animals in the temple? Because as I said, there are things you need to buy in order to make your offerings. Another question to think about is who is selling the animals? Are they foreigners? Are they Jews? Are they temple authorities? And then does it have to do with exorbitant prices of selling the animals? And so a lot of those details are a little bit hard to recreate when you look at the account. If you read commentaries, let's say on Luke, just kind of your standard commentaries, they gloss over all that issue of what's wrong with it. Well, of course, it's defiling the temple by making it a common marketplace. But when I read it, that's a little more difficult for me to see, like I said, because sacrifices are very practical, and you need pure animals and you need to keep them without defect. And so you want to get them close to the temple as you can, so that when you have your pure animal, nothing will happen to it. If it sprains an ankle, you can't offer that one. So, but clearly Jesus is offended with the intention of what's going on, or some other aspect of what's going on. And so he's calling it a marketplace. So according to John, he's calling it a marketplace. And then his disciples afterwards remember what was written: zeal for your house will devour me, will consume me. And we'll talk about this. Okay, we'll talk about this now. So in John, it's not a direct quote from the Bible, but there is a good context that matches it. Again, the phrase in John 2:16 and 17 is a house of trade, ikon emporiou. And people think this is hinting to Zechariah 14:21, because at the end of Zechariah, you have all these kind of messianic / end of days prophecies. And the very end, in chapter 14, it says this verse: every cooking pot in Jerusalem and Judah will become holy in the sight of the Lord of heaven's armies, so that all who offer sacrifices may come and use some of them to boil their sacrifices in them. On that day, there will no longer be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord of heaven's armies. And then we can understand Canaanite as merchant, or you could understand Canaanite as a Canaanite. And I'm going to argue for the merchant here in a bit. You can see there in the Greek, when the Greeks translated this Old Testament passage in Zechariah, they translated it literally: there will not be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord. But it's interesting that in Zechariah, he seems to be predicting an expansion of holiness, where every cooking pot in Jerusalem and Judah will become holy. I mean, if you take that literally, Hebron's in Judah, like Bethlehem, it's a whole big, much wider range of holiness than, just the little temple there. And why? What has made it holy now? And does that mean all who offer sacrifices are also holy? Like, have you opened it up to many people? And so then when you come to there will no longer be a Canaanite, does that mean because you've gotten rid of all the Canaanites? Or does that mean there will no longer be a merchant in the house of the Lord? And so we have to ask ourselves, well, why would you translate Canaanite merchant, right? All right, let's ask that. I put a nice net note to Zechariah 14:21, the Net Bible, on the word Canaanite. It says, or merchant trader, because Canaanites, especially Phoenicians, were merchants and traders. And then they give you a reference of Brown Driver Briggs Bible Dictionary. And then they show you all the different versions of the Bible that translate Canaanite or traders. So you see the King James Version, New King James, NASB, NIV go with Canaanite, and the RSV and the NEB go with trader, and the other ones just made it plural, NRSV and NLT, or merchant, NAB. So they're really split between Canaanite and merchant. And then the ones who go with the one translation would give you a note that, well, the other option is also possible. Some context in the Bible, both options make sense. And so it really comes down to intuition. And you can't just, even if you go with one, you think it's one, you can't completely eliminate the possibility it's the other. And that, I think for me, that just increases humility, because no matter what we think we understand, we might have gotten something wrong. And it keeps us coming back and reading the text over again.
And can it also have a double meaning?
It could. For instance, Canaanites, when we think about Canaanites proper, we think more ancient Israel. We think when Israel first came into the land. By the time when the Assyrians came and took over the north, so you're talking 722, 21 BC, they exiled the whole northern part of the country, what we call the Israelite kingdom, and as well as the Canaanites living there and all the other peoples living there. And they took those people and they put them in other places. They mixed them all around. And so some of the people were left over, yes. And there was, intermarriage and, stragglers that stayed on, poor people and all of this. But basically, Canaanites as like a big nation that you think about aren't really talked about much after that. Now it becomes more of, it seems to become more of a merchant thing. Obviously, there were still Canaanites that stayed in the country and married other people from other countries, because Assyrians the people they exile, they like to mix them all around. I think that way they felt that the people would have more allegiance to Assyria and not to their own little people group. So they mixed the exiles in the north around in other countries, and they brought other countries here. You have that whole text about in Samaria, there are lions eating people, and they wanted to figure out, well, what does the God of this country want? Because we're getting eaten here. Anyway, so Canaanite probably became more of a term of merchants. You see in Proverbs 31:24. Again, you could argue this here is also a Canaanite, but look at the context. She made linen garments, then sold them, and traded belts to the merchants. Okay, so the word there translated in English with no apology is Canaanite in Hebrew. And if you look in the Greek, I didn't highlight it in yellow, but the very last word in Greek, Canaanites, that's to the Canaanites. So
that means that the Canaanites were already for a long time traders.
Yes, they were. They were in ancient days traders, particularly Phoenicians. The word Punic and Phoenician, they're just a kind. Eventually, people started using that word over Canaanite, but they're Canaanites. So all the area of Tzor, like Lebanon, Tyre, and Sidon, they're big Canaanite centers. They always were. Yeah. And they were traders. They had ships on the sea. They were big traders. And they were known since antiquity. They were known to be traders. And here, of course, in Proverbs 31, you have the parallel context. You see this as a context of trading. She makes this linen garment and she sells it. And she makes a belt or waistband and she gives it to the merchant. That would be the most natural reading in this context because you're dealing with trading and selling. But the Greeks decided to translate quite literally here for some reason and put the Canaanite. And whether in Greeks in the day that this translation was made, maybe they already understood Canaanite to be merchant. So they could be literal, and you get what we mean. There's always that understanding as well. So there's another verse like this in Isaiah 23:8. And here the pointing of the Masoretic text is a little different. It doesn't say the Canaanite, but you can see alphabetically it's the same letters, Kinaaneha. And it could be some version of coming from Canaanite. So I'll read you the translation. Who planned this for royal Tyre, or crowned or crowning Tyre? It's a very strange word there. Whose merchants are princes, whose traders are the dignitaries of the earth. So they're describing Tyre, like I just mentioned, so in Hebrew, this big Canaanite city out on the cliff, towards the sea. Phoenicia, Phoenician, that just means later Canaanite. They're known, their merchants are princes and their traders are the dignitaries of the earth. And so the words in Hebrew that are merchants and traders are sohareha, her traders, or merchants here, actually, literally merchants, and kinaaneha, so somehow from Kanaani. And then the Greeks here did not translate Kanaanim, they translated traders, empori. So one of our Hebrew texts got a literal translation, one got a more idiomatic translation. But these are two verses we've looked at, one in Isaiah and one in Proverbs, that shows the word Canaanite being used in the sense of a merchant. Now, I did not do a complete check of all references of Canaanite, so there may be others. In fact, I know there's another one. There's one about the scale in the Canaanite's hand, but I didn't find it. And so these are the ones I'm giving as paradigmatic. And I can't tell you how many times in the Bible Canaanite means merchant. So how did that relate back to John? If you remember, John was alluding to Zechariah 14, where you have this merchant. And in John, he's saying, don't make my house a house of trade. And then in Zechariah 14, it says there's no longer going to be this merchant in Jerusalem or trader or whatever. And if Jesus read Kanaani as a merchant, it makes very much sense what he did in the temple, because as part of his messianic fulfillment, there's not supposed to be any more traders in the temple, according to Zechariah. So, let's get rid of them, because we're entering this day of the Lord that's beginning with Jesus, the kingdom of heaven that's at hand right now that Jesus is ushering in. And so he would be kind of doing a prophetic action, you could say, based in Zechariah. Okay, so the second half of this John 2:16-17 is the zeal of your house will eat me up, will devour or consume me. I don't know, whatever your translations say. Now, this is put in the mouth of his disciples. They remember afterwards. And later we're going to read John's whole description. It's so kind of dramatic that it seems like his disciples are trying to understand, like, whoa, why is he so angry? Or how can we explain this outburst, basically? And so they remember this verse, zeal for your house will devour me. Sorry, what did I do? And this comes from Psalm 69:9. Ki kinat betcha achalatni, v'herpot horfecha naflu alai. Certainly zeal for your house consumes me. I endure the insults of those who insult you. So with poetry, the tenses are always kind of flexible, the way you interpret them. It literally says, zeal consumed me. So our translators in the Greek said, has eaten me up, has consumed me. Zeal for your house has eaten me up. And you see in our text, zeal of your house will eat me up. And why do I even bring this up? Why am I pointing out this little difference? I just want you to be aware that when people quote Old Testament or original Testament in the New Testament passages, they often make little changes. And especially there's a lot of people who say, oh, well, no one knew Hebrew, so they were just quoting from the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament. Absolutely not, because every time they quote, it's different from the Septuagint. Not every, but many, many, many times. And so it's
does the fact that there was an oral tradition that you could speak more of a living language in those citations, in which there is some flexibility?
Yes, I mean, in many of them, I think we've shown in this Bible study, the discussions are based on Hebrew, and you see that. they're quoting text, even though they're writing about it in Greek, they're thinking about it in Hebrew. And so they might translate what they're thinking about in Hebrew slightly differently than what the Greek translators did in 250 BC. And so there'll be little differences. And maybe even they will change it on purpose to suit the particular context, the point that they're trying to make. And so
and then the combination of different prophets in the citation Jesus makes, is that also regular in other manuscripts? You see
the
that
different
more?
citations.
Well, he says one line, but it's a citation of different prophets in different places. It's combination.
Yeah. No, you can mix and match. Absolutely. Normally, you would draw two passages together because they share a certain form, like ve'afta. There's only two contexts where you have the command, or it's kind of like a future, you shall love. And one relates to God and the other to the neighbor. And so people drew those two commands together based on that rare form. So oftentimes you have a rare form connecting two verses. And what we saw here with Jesus, it's a little more complex than that. I don't see a particular form that connects it, but it's more the themes, let's say, that are connecting it up. And maybe sometimes he's making an original connection of his own to try to make a point. Because again, if you live in Jesus' time, like we're having to look at concordances and figure out what verse is what. In that time, people knew their Bible. You could quote a verse and they actually remember the whole chunk it comes from. And so when you quote two verses together, they immediately have these two contexts like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, so you're saying this. Oh, wow. And it's a totally different world, unfortunately, that we live in. But so now we have to try to go back and think, well, why did he connect those things? What was he trying to say? What was it based on? And how was he using it? So we also have to look at this story a bit from the Matthew and Mark side. So we kind of get a full version of these different witnesses. I'll read from Matthew 21, 12 to 13. Then Jesus entered the temple area and drove out all those who were selling and buying in the temple courts, and turned over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves. And he said to them, "It is written, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are turning it into a den of robbers." And then I just put in for context afterward, the blind and lame came to him at the temple courts and he healed them. That comes right after in Matthew. So we see some differences here. We see some details we didn't have in Luke. He drove out all those who were selling and buying. That's interesting. The other one, Luke just has sellers, because the buyers are presumably everyone coming to the temple. And so why would you be getting rid of them? Like they're just coming to the temple. But here they're both mentioned. And then turning over the tables is mentioned, of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves. That's a new detail. And then he quotes the same verses here. It's still Isaiah 56:7 and Jeremiah 7:11. But he links them. He says, but you are turning it into. That's interesting. In Luke, you have made it, but now you're turning it into it. So it's a process. It's something that's happening. By what you're doing, this is essentially what is happening. You're turning it into a den of robbers. So maybe, in the Matthew account, you can see a little bit more of this interpretation of why he's pulling in the den of robbers. Because of how you're doing things here, you're actually lining up with what Jeremiah was talking about in 7:11, that your actions aren't right, and you're missing the whole point, basically. And it's also interesting that afterwards, the blind and lame come to him in the temple courts and he heals them. Because to me, that kind of ties into the Isaiah background of the house of prayer becoming house of prayer for all nations. And these people who are normally excluded can now become included more. And that's just a little association, I guess I have. So here's the Mark version. And Mark has probably the most complete in terms of the amount of detail compared to the other synoptics. John, we'll see, is the longest, most complete, but Mark would be out of the synoptics. Then they came to Jerusalem. Jesus entered the temple area and began to drive out those who were selling and buying in the temple courts. That's much like Matthew. He turned over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves, and he would not permit anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. Then he began to teach them and said, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations'? But you have turned it into a den of robbers." Okay, so this is interesting because he turns over the tables of money changers and the people selling doves, and he wouldn't permit anyone to carry merchandise through the temple. Mark is the only one who mentions this detail. He wouldn't permit anyone to carry merchandise. Well, what is wrong with that? And maybe, that's why I think back to the Robinson's Arch. Maybe he was seeing that the temple was being used as a shortcut somehow, where people are coming from the upper city, walking straight through the temple courts and then out again, just because it was easier than, the pathway down the valley and like this and that. So maybe in that sense, it was sacrilegious because you're not coming to the temple because you actually want to come to the temple. You're just using it as a shortcut. And so in Jesus' mind, that is not having the respect of the temple area that it should. Even though if we're in the Gentile court, there's nothing necessarily like it's not a holy ground right there. You could be there and be impure, for instance.
But it is a place of prayer. So when he cites, "My house shall be called a house of prayer."
Yes, house of prayer relates to the temple.
Yeah.
My house is the temple. So if you are outside of the temple, which technically you are in the Gentile court, it doesn't have the same level of sanctity as a temple itself. But that
is where all nations are praying.
Yeah.
Because they cannot come in the other section. So when all nations...
So you're arguing for an extension of the holiness because that is the purpose of the area. That's nice.
But because of the citation you just pointed out to, my house shall be a house of prayer for all people. Nations.
Exactly.
So when they want to pray,
that could be part of it. That could be part of it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like preserving the area around the temple to turn people toward the purpose of the temple. Like you're already starting to think about God, you're praying, and Jesus was sitting there teaching. This is an interesting point here. He began to teach them. So in Mark, you don't have as dramatic of an experience. He definitely makes an impression because he flips some tables and he stops people passing, but then he sits down and teaches. So it's almost like, now I'm going to tell you why I just did that kind of thing. And he says, "Is it not written?" And he quotes the one, and then, "But you have turned it into a den of robbers." And so now they're having to think, okay, what have we done and why? Okay, also in Luke, right after he connects these two verses together, we have that he was teaching daily in the temple courts. So again, he's sitting down to teach. But Luke mentions that as a segue to the chief priests and the experts in the law and the prominent leaders among the people were seeking to assassinate him, or you could say to do away with him. But they could not find a way to do it, for all the people hung on his words. And I like that phrase, hung on his words. it shows you, and I think sometimes we forget this in, our crucifixion stories. We forget how much crowd support he had. His teaching was magnetic, like people were coming and listening, and he's famous. And so that is what is keeping the people who are trying to get rid of him, keeping them from doing it, because they can't figure out how to do it. After this in Luke, it starts the next chapter. So of course, we're going to look at this more in detail, but just to give you the context and the flow, that's when Jesus was teaching people in the temple courts, proclaiming the gospel. The chief priests and the experts in the law with the elders came up and said to him, "Tell us, by what authority are you doing these things? Or who is it who gave you this authority?" So kind of, again, you could view it as trying to trip him up in his answer, or simply, a justification of what just happened. Of course, here, this is some time later because he's teaching daily. So we've seen in both Mark and Luke, you have, after the whole scene on upturning the tables and everything, he teaches. And so it's a very much more level-headed scene than we get later. And the same thing, Mark and Luke both have this idea that at this point they were trying to figure out a way to take him out, to take Jesus out. And our translation is assassinate. For they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed by his teaching. So we have two reports that everyone loves his teaching, and the leaders were afraid to touch him because of that. But they were trying to figure out some way that they could. Okay, so in Matthew, right after our temple scene, we already read this, blind and lame came to him in the temple courts, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the experts in the law saw the wonderful things he did and heard the children crying out in the temple courts, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they became indignant and said to him, "Do you hear what they are saying?" Jesus said to them, "Yes. Have you never read, out of the mouths of children and nursing infants, you have prepared praise for yourself?" Of course, he's quoting Psalm 8. And leaving them, he went out of the city to Bethany and spent the night there. So here, again, Jesus is in the temple courts. He's healing. We don't have a scene where he's teaching, but he could have been healing and teaching together. And then they come up and they say, "Hey, these kids over here are yelling out, 'Hosanna to the Son of David.'" And so we've talked a bit about that. That is a messianic claim. Son of David is another term for Messiah. Hosanna means literally "save us, please," or "save, please." And it's something that you would say to the Messiah, or to this king that is going to be anointed to come and save them. And so, of course, the authorities are saying, they're hinting that he should be stopping this. And Jesus is saying, no, that's exactly what they should be doing. So these are some, as we're thinking through these Gospels and the context of this story, this is going to be a part of that. Is this the final stage of Jesus' ministry? And is he showing now that he's the Messiah and, it's all leading up to the crucifixion, or not? So now let's turn to John. And for John, we're in chapter 2, 13 to 16. He found in the temple courts those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers sitting at tables, which, by the way, here it's a different word for money changer. Kermatistas. Different than the Synoptic Gospels, I should say. So he made a whip of cords, or of rope, and drove them all out of the temple courts with the sheep and the oxen. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold the doves, he said, "Take these things away from here. Do not make my Father's house a marketplace." his disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will devour me. So here, as we mentioned before, is probably the most detailed account and also the most dramatic of the accounts. You have tables being overturned. You have specific mention of the other places. No one has yet mentioned sheep and oxen. They mentioned dove sellers, or one of them mentioned dove sellers, but this is like quite a bit more. And then you have the whip. In some manuscripts, he made what was like a whip out of cords. So it wasn't like necessarily a true whip. It was, tying together some ropes and shooing people away and shooing them all away. And the sheep and oxen. And I think that's kind of ironic because normally you have a whip for animals. So when you're shooing everyone away, I'm expecting the sheep and the oxen. So then you meant, and also the sheep and oxen, you're like, oh, you meant you were shooing the other people away? It's kind of funny, but he's put them all in the same camp, essentially. All of you, animals and your sellers, get out of here. And then he scatters the coins of the money changer and overturns their tables. And so, yeah, detailed. He uses slightly different way of describing this, slightly different words. So you can tell that the John account is coming from a different firsthand witness, let's say, than the synoptics. And another main thing is that he's saying different verses at the end. However, we'll remember that the zeal for your house will devour me is something his disciples remember afterwards. So they're not actually saying he said that. What he said, he addresses the people selling and he says, take these things away from here. Do not make my father's house a marketplace. And so that presumably would link back to Zechariah. It also ties in well with the Jeremiah, don't turn it into a den of robbers. It's just simply not using that same phrase. And then just to be complete, the context in John has the Jewish leaders responding, what sign can you show us since you are doing these things? Jesus replied, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up again. Then the Jewish leaders said to him, this temple has been under construction for 46 years. And are you going to raise it up in 3 days? But Jesus was speaking about the temple of his body. So after he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the saying that Jesus had spoken. So this 46-year reference is kind of curious, but I was reading that at least one dating of when they began building the Antonia fortress was 19 BC. So that would then add up to 27. If Jesus is saying this, well, I guess it also depends, 27 AD, is that the beginning of his ministry? All these things are kind of a question, but it's interesting that 46 years could actually fit in there somehow.
Is the expression temple of his body, is that the general concept?
Yes. Well, this is something I didn't stress that because I've just preached a sermon on it. And I love the concept. We often miss it, but Jesus says he is the temple. And I really like that because it's the temple that bears all the sins, the intentional sins and the impurities of the people, or the tabernacle does, according to Leviticus 16, I think it's 16. So it's a really, really nice image that, Jesus took that on himself. And then, of course, you have the temple curtain ripping, like by ripping his body, he is allowed access to God. So there's all kinds of beautiful parallels there.
Is beside that also a Jewish concept? Could anybody say that his body was the temple, or is it specific to the Messiah or to Jesus?
I don't think so. And in fact, we see in this text that when he said it, nobody was thinking about it as a metaphor. They were all thinking about the actual temple. But then afterwards, they realized, of course, there's a reference to 3 days, and I will raise it up again. It's kind of like they figured it out over time. So yeah, I don't think it wasn't something that you would expect other Jews to claim or say. And I think that there is some claim there towards divinity because God chose to make his name dwell in a temple. He chose to live, to be housed in a temple. So if Jesus is saying, I'm the temple, he's also saying, God is in me. You know, I am the divine expression of God.
Well, you also have the word of the Lord saying, I'm not living in a temple made by man.
Sure. Sure you do. And you have everything in its context, you know, and but he did, around everywhere it says, you know, I chose to put my name there. And yeah. And this is the metaphor that Jesus has given us to understand himself. That's what's interesting to me. And growing up in the church, you don't hear it much. You don't hear, oh, Jesus is the temple. Oh yeah, Jesus is the temple. Like you hear Jesus is the Lamb, Jesus is the Lion of Judah, Jesus is this and that. You just don't hear the temple much. And I think it's a shame because it's a really, really beautiful image. It means so much if you understand the temple, if you know about the temple, and it really means something. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression.
Just before you digress further, I was just thinking about what Richard said just now. I mean, if you go back to, I don't live in a building, he's really beginning to already start the idea of the metaphor or the allegory.
Yeah. Well, let's wait for comments to the end, and then we'll discuss more of this. I did also want to point out that Marcia gave 2 nice quotes in the chat about the sheep gate. These are way back. The sheep gate on the north. She's suggesting maybe the animals went in there. And I was thinking that could also be as well. We remember where the Antonia Fortress was, not on that corner, but the other corner. That may be, that would be a good point of entry. Plus there, it's the least steep in terms of terrain that you could get people in. And then she gave me the reference for that I was quoting before, don't trust in the temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord, from Jeremiah 7:4. So yeah, so in this study, we've done both things. We've talked about the temple as something not to trust in, and yet it is God's presence, you know, in the world. So just goes to show you have to take each thing in its context. But back to comparing, I want to compare the synoptics and John. We mentioned that synoptics have this different word for money changer. Okay, that's fine. That just shows that they didn't copy each other. That's all that shows. So, but if you have the same word used in Matthew and Mark, oh, maybe they did all use the same source, something like that. That's why you would point out a detail like that. And then they use a slightly different word. I mean, in Greek, it's like English, you can do little add-ons to the verb. So one has katastrephin and one has anastrephin. You know, but the base word is the same. So, but it is a slight difference. So you can see the synoptics lining up with the use of the one verb, and John has another. So it's just a minor difference. And then we pointed out all the details that John includes that the other gospels didn't, like sheep and oxen, whip of ropes, scattering coins, Jesus actually saying to the, I think it was the dove sellers, take these things away from here. Oh, sorry. On the synoptic side, wait, where did I go? Yeah, okay. Mark has probably the most violent detail out of all the synoptics. Luke is the shortest one. And Mark is the only one who mentions Jesus saying, don't use the temple as a shortcut. Don't just carry things through here. And I'm interpreting that, of course, saying don't use it as a shortcut. And I found someone else who interpreted that way. You could also say maybe carrying heavy things was just distracting, or something like Richard's approach, where if people are trying to pray there in the courts, you're just being a distraction. And then, of course, another big difference is the verses Jesus is referring to. Is it Isaiah 56:7 spliced with Jeremiah 7:11, or an allusion to Zechariah 14:21 and Psalm 69:9 as an explanation? Now, there's always a possibility of all three of those things being said. We talked about the differing contexts. Matthew has a kid singing Hosanna ben David, followed by the story of the fig tree. And Mark has him trying to kill Jesus, followed by the fig tree. So Matthew and Mark line up with this story coming before the fig tree. And then Mark and Luke line up with this being the event that makes people try to figure out a way to get rid of him. And then in Luke, they ask him, by what authority do you do these things? John's context is, show us a sign for doing these things. So kind of prove to us, justify your prophetic act here. Why are you doing this? And in John, this is the biggest difference of context. If you look at the end, synoptics all have this at the end of Jesus' ministry, and John has it right at the beginning. So if he's doing this prophetic act, it makes total sense. People will turn and say, what are you doing? Justify this. Who are you and what are you doing? And it's kind of like the introduction to his messianic ministry, you could say. And then the synoptics is the culmination where it's going to lead to his crucifixion. The interesting thing when you approach this kind of question, okay, what was it? If the cleansing of the temple happened once, when did it happen? Was it at the beginning of the ministry or the end? And could it have been two events or one event? It's always possible he did it twice. Is it probable? I don't know. But here's another thing to remember. Synoptics only have one trip to Jerusalem. So what does that mean? They have already telescoped all of Jesus' ministry into one trip to Jerusalem, where John has multiple trips. And, a lot of people that try to do harmonizations of everything and kind of figure out what happened, they come up with this 3 years of ministry. And so if you've taken 3 years of ministry and you've only mentioned one trip to Jerusalem, you've already condensed everything and kind of reformatted it for a particular need. And if they've done that, if synoptics have already made it one trip to Jerusalem, well, of course, it has to be at the end of his ministry, because that's his one trip to Jerusalem. And so it has to come at the end of his ministry, and because that's when he's at the temple. If he's only at the temple once in their gospel, that's where they have to put that story. So it could have happened at the beginning of his ministry, but they just put it there because they had to, because that's how those are the stories that they're telling. I think what we see in these stories are definitely some type of fulfillment of messianic passages. When you think both synoptics and John seem to be pointing back to messianic passages. You have Zechariah 14, you have, Jeremiah 7:11 is not necessarily messianic. That's more the heart of the kingdom of God, like what really matters, which actually is consistent throughout time. What really matters are how you act, whether you obey God and whether you do what he's asked you to do, and, but then Isaiah 56:7 is kind of more a messianic era. You can see there where there's like this expansion where people have always thought of God as their own God in the land of Israel, or maybe just the land of Judah. And now Isaiah is blowing their mind by saying, no, people all over the world are going to come and join in to worship God at his temple. And so you can see how Jesus ushering in his kingdom is going to be referencing that. And maybe if last week was a prophetic act, you could say, of crying, this cleansing of the temple could maybe be seen as a prophetic act, where it's almost like it's not so much that it's a terrible thing that there were money lenders there or people selling, but because there were, it can be a jumping pad to these other texts that are actually fulfillments of who Jesus is. And so it can be an occasion to highlight that, really. So I don't have a conclusive reason that is for sure what was bothering Jesus so much. I mean, we have listed many options. Just the fact that if people were praying in that area or going towards trying to meet with God, it's a distraction. That's kind of a practical obvious. Or that somehow that they were trying to make more money than they should have been, and it should have just been, straightforward, simple things, and it's not, maybe it wasn't being overseen properly, so people were charging exorbitant rates, and he was upset by that. But again, that's not written in the text, right? And so, but something in the attitude, if you look at Jeremiah chapter 7:11, you can see that Jesus is trying to say something in the way your attitude or your actions, the way you've been doing this is wrong about it. And so don't whitewash over it. It doesn't count. And then, of course, when you go, we already mentioned the messianic fulfillment, whether this is opening Jesus' ministry or right before he's crucified, it is kind of pointing to him as the Messiah. And even the context, several of the different contexts allude to that in different ways. Matthew has the children singing Hosanna, and just, the Isaiah opening up the temple to the world, Jesus basically claiming this is through me that it's opened up to people who before couldn't be part.